Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, and non-binary conformists. Welcome to the 15th edition of Webster Speak, Dialogue on Race, Equity, and Inclusion. I am your moderator, Brian Ballet, graduate student at Webster University and the graduate assistant of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Tonight, we will discuss Asian racism in America, particularly those from East Asian communities. You can ask questions on Twitter using hashtag Webster Speaks or email me at brianballet14@webster.edu. Again, Brian, B-R-I-A-N, Ballet, B-A-R-L-A-Y, 14@webster.edu. We will get to as many questions as we can. And now, here is our host, Webster University Chief Diversity Officer, Vincent C. Flewellen.
Thank you, Brian, and good evening to all. Before we get started, we just want to say that the opinions expressed by any speaker, panelist, or participant as part of Webster Speaks represents the individual views of the person expressing these opinions and do not represent statements made by or on behalf of Webster University. The university presents this program for educational purposes and to encourage academic discourse. Last year, former President Trump referred to COVID-19 as the China virus or the Wuhan flu. This derisive term sparked many conversations and likely contributed to incidents of hate and violence toward the Asian community. As a global university, we firmly stand against all acts of hate against any group of people. This episode is named "We Are Not a Virus," based on the biased rhetoric that Asian people were responsible for COVID. Our guests tonight are Dr. Mary Lai Preuss, an associate professor and department chair in the biology department at Webster University. Dr. Nicole Lee Johnson is associate professor of the Graduate Department of Education and chair of University Senate's Multicultural Studies Committee, both at Webster University. Side note, she's also the chair of my doctoral program at Webster. Dewitt Campbell.
Thank you.
The director, thank you.
Thanks.
Dewitt Campbell III, program director for the NCCJ of Metropolitan St. Louis, and also a childhood friend of mine. Hateful acts against Asians in America are certainly not new. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 banned the immigration of Chinese into America. And in 1942, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there was a mass drafting of Japanese to concentration camps. I'd like to start off by saying first, last week, the Senate passed an anti-Asian hate crime bill, 94-1, and the House is set to pass it as well. It sets aside money for education, law enforcement training, and easier reporting of anti-Asian hate crimes. I'd like to start off by asking you all, is this enough? Start with you, Dr. Preuss.
Well, I think it's a start because, I think a lot of these conversations are relatively, new in the Asian community, at least from my experience. And so the fact that this is being brought to the forefront at the national level is really encouraging. Now, whether or not that's enough, probably not, but at least it's the beginning.
Thank you. Dr. Lee Johnson?
I agree with Mary. I am very happy as a Chinese American to see that bill coming out. It's a very encouraging thing that's happening in this country, especially when we have a long history, for instance, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and a long history of, like Vincent mentioned, Chinese internment camps and all sorts of yellow peril. I'm citing some of the references that I found in the literature. So it's very exciting that we have this new bill coming out.
Thank you. Dewitt, what are your thoughts?
Sure. Let me start by saying and reminding everyone that the one vote against the act was Josh Hawley from Missouri, which isn't surprising, but it is certainly frustrating. I think it is really important to have this act. There's been hate towards folks from different Asian communities since the beginning of this country. And sometimes it goes unacknowledged. And so if for no other reason than just making sure that it is acknowledged as another form of hate, just like many of the other forms of hate that we experience on this continent, I think that's really important. And probably needs more to come.
More to come for sure. Dewitt, you kind of touched on where I wanted to go next, which is the fact that Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri was the lone voter against this bill, saying that it amounts to governmental overreach. Dewitt, why don't you continue to share with us your reactions to that, and we'll work our way through our other two panelists.
I guess saying malarkey is safe to say in mixed company. I think that there are lots of efforts that are overreach if what your goal is to have white supremacy be in charge. And so there are lots of things. And this is just one of those things, one of many things that is making a challenge to white supremacy in the United States. Our demographics are changing. White supremacy is fighting its kind of last stand battles right now, and they're very loud. But I think the demographics of this country are changing no matter what some folks want to have happen. But we've got to ride out these loud last gasps, I think.
Very good, thank you. What about you, Dr. Lee Johnson?
I completely agree with Dewitt. I just felt that there was a pushback, and I don't know the real reason for it, because I read the news that it says that, quote unquote, he said it's too broad. It's overreach, according to Dewitt. Personally, I think it's just another pushback to not have something that is pro-Asian. So that's how personal opinion.
So still rooted in racism and
correct.
Thank you. Dr. Preuss?
Yeah, I think that he's trying to appeal to a base that he has, right? A base that is rooted in people who are not as accepting of differences in our communities. And so all this does is it creates an environment that it creates fear in certain communities, but it empowers other communities. And so he's obviously trying to empower certain groups and put down others. So unfortunately, he's our elected official, and that's our responsibility then to deal with that.
Speak more to that. What do you mean?
Well, our people voted him into office. And so if we want change to happen, if we want this to not be an issue anymore, then we need to use our votes in order to remove him.
Thank you.
I agree with Mary. I just personally felt that a lot of times my vote might not mean much, because when I try to vote, every time I found that it's, the majority wins, right, in the state of Missouri. So that's the other concern of me being a minority living in Missouri, sometimes how I felt.
That your vote almost doesn't count.
Correct. The majority has that, I would say, some hidden racism still. And then that's the part that it doesn't feel like I can belong, almost to the point that I felt like I'm always outsider.
I can relate to that at various times as well. How much of what has transpired related to former President Trump's highly publicized rhetoric, and how much is based on existing prejudice against Asians, do you believe? Dr. Lee?
Yes, so I have read about this in the literature. So I'm citing some literature here that they talked about terms like Chinese plague, Chinese virus, Kung flu. These are the terminologies that really hurt the identity. And they almost create an identity crisis. That's what I term it, for Asians in USA and also overseas. And so because of that, I did an anonymous survey study since last April. And then I cited personal stories. So respondents who tell me stories about being Asian. So I collected about 114 responses. And then some of them says, they were very real. Like one of them says that some friends are coming to Missouri and St. Louis to visit, and they were being called slant eye. Some of the terminology is yellow monkey. That's a racist slur. And go back to your SHIT HOLE communist country. So there are a lot of these racist slurs and racism that's really existing because of the COVID, and also for a lot of fear about the Asian community. I would say that definitely created a lot of crisis for us. And so my article, it's titled, "We Are Not a Virus, Solidarity and Resilience for Contesting the Renewed Yellow Peril, Xenophobia and Xenophobia Amid COVID-19. I believe this is the time we all get together and fight for the rights of Asians in the country."
Did you say you're citing that article, or is that an article that you wrote?
It's the article I wrote. So we Are Not a Virus is actually from one of the respondents. So she's a college student, and she's studying here in the United States. So she expressed concerns, and when her mom tells her you have to just keep quiet and stay quiet, even if something happened, try to pretend you didn't hear anything, she was saying that, no, this is not right. We are not a virus. Why do we have to be too worried about wearing a mask, walking on the street, or just being who we are? And so I'm citing and using that direct quote from that respondent, "We are not a virus," in my article. So my article, it's under review now by a journal. So that's this past year, I've been presenting at different conferences like the Harvard Conference and also AERA, American Educational Research Association, with this title, because I think this is a very important topic.
Well, good luck to you on the review, and we look forward to being able to read that. And hopefully you might be able to share that with us, so we can share it out as a resource. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Preuss, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, going off of what Nicole was saying, I think that's wonderful, the research that you're doing there. I think Asians, like as for myself, my experience is that we've always tried to fit in, right? And we've always tried to fly under the radar as a minority group and not stir the pot. I know that's the message that I grew up with from my parents. They always felt like they stood out, being new immigrants. And so for their kids, they wanted us to just be like normal Americans. And as a result, I think that has suppressed the conversation about issues among Asians in the US. And so with former President Trump, escalating the rhetoric about Asians, I think that just brought up things among people that either were not well understood or were stereotypes that probably existed all along, just because that conversation was never had before and was not well understood. But then these conversations brought everything to the forefront. And so that has been a major issue. And I think in my mind, I've always felt, I've been very fortunate that throughout my life, I feel like I've been in communities where I've been very included and accepted. However, with the more recent rhetoric, there have been times when I have not felt safe. And this is, because of the recent events that have occurred.
I want to talk a little bit about that not feeling safe piece. And I want to acknowledge that I've heard you say that. And if you would allow me a moment just to have Dewitt answer that question, I'd like for us to come back to that. Dewitt?
I don't think that Trump particularly created much hate. I think he invited that hate to the public square. He invited that to the party that we've been going to parties all along, and now he's allowed hate to be right there next to love and appreciation and respect. And so what his rhetoric invited that out of the woodwork, but I think it had to have already existed. I think our country really needs to grapple with the fact that we've taught lots of hate. And when there are things that we don't understand, we get fearful of them, and we make up stories to fill in the gaps of our knowledge. And we usually fill in those stories with yucky stuff and not with really warm and fuzzy stuff. And we really need to work on that. And we need leadership that helps us move hate out of the public square again.
Hate is actually, in my opinion, an un-American thing, right? And I think that it is the American thing to call it out and to address that and not to in any way endorse that. There have been more than 2,100 reports of violence against Asians in 2020 and 2021 to date. Some say it may be as many as 3,800. The Atlanta spa workers' murders, the assault on the 65-year-old grandmother going to church in Manhattan, and so many others that don't make headlines. People being spit upon, blamed for the coronavirus, assaulted, and more. How quickly after the pandemic began did you begin to notice that Asians were being targeted in your own experiences?
I would say go back to about March of last year when it first happened. I already have heard about that in the news. And at the very beginning, I remember notifying my husband, and I was saying that, oh, I don't feel safe because we have two girls, and there's three and 6, so smaller young girls. And I was very concerned about their safety, how they would be very, if they walk on the street in our neighborhood, they will be like the only Asian looking girls on the street. And myself, I'm like the only Asian woman on my whole neighborhood. And so I have a lot of concerns about that. And then when I went outside to the pharmacy, I still remember I was wearing a mask. At the time, wearing a mask or not was not recognized. People were fighting and saying that mask is not efficient. And if you wear a mask, they assume you carry the germs. And so I was wearing the mask going to pharmacy, and then the cashier looked at me and asked me a lot of questions because I got some, just some throat candies. And so she was starting to say, are you sick? Why you, if you're really serious sick, and then start trying to gauge into why I'm there. And so, and it's only targeting me. So all the other customers have no such questions asked. So it's just me. And then I remember walking down the street feeling very worried about my safety and my children's safety.
Dr. Preuss?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, you would start to see more coverage in the news media and on social media of these kinds of incidents. And for me, I have a story about when I went up to Wisconsin with my daughter, and it was kind of a rural area. And because of my poor planning, I hadn't, gotten dinner for us. And so it was very late at night. And I was calling around trying to find a place to get some food, and I found a place. So I went there to pick up the food, and it was really out in the middle of nowhere, nothing else around. And, because of all the rhetoric, I was a little bit unsure, since I knew I would be the only Asian person anywhere, within miles. And as I'm walking in, and I'm a very diligent mask wearer, so I wear my mask all the time. But as I'm walking in, I see the place is pretty full, and it's all white people, and nobody's wearing a mask. And this was in the middle of winter when, cases were still high. And this was before the vaccine and everything. And I was terrified. I was like, I don't want to go in there. First of all, as an Asian person, and second of all, as an Asian person wearing a mask, because I felt like it just, put a big target on me. So I took off my mask and walked in, which I felt awful about, but I'm like, I got to feed my kid. And so nothing happened, right? I mean, these people were probably super sweet and wonderful people, but it was all the rhetoric in the media that then led to this just overarching fear that something was going to happen, right? Because I was Asian. And so, and I don't think this is anything new to a lot of people, right? But it was the first time it happened to me, and that made a big impression on me.
Dr. Preuss, when you say you don't know that this is something that's new to a lot of people, do you mean in terms of Asians, or do you?
Anybody who looks different, I think, can be a target in some way, right? And so, and depending on the environment that you're in and how comfortable you feel, you know, in your own environment, typically you have a lot of comfort, but once you go outside of that environment, then there's a lot of unknowns. And so if you look different, if you act different, if you dress different, that could be preyed upon.
I'm going to say this is one of the things I really like about Webster Speaks, dialogues on race, equity, and inclusion. For the most part, our conversations have really been about the experience of African Americans. And this, you know, the series itself came about as the result of the murder of George Floyd this past summer. But one of the things that I do know to be true is that people of color, regardless of our identity, right? Just being a person of color, I think in many ways, what you said, Dr. Preuss, is so true, is that to be different is to also set yourself up for the possibility of who knows what, right? And it's a matter of safety. You've spoken of safety. Dr. Lee Johnson, you've spoken of safety, right?
Yes.
Safety? Go ahead.
Can I pick you up back on that? So when the pandemic happened, I still remember because I have to go to some school district and observe. And then at the time I was having a lot of concerns wearing masks. I think what I want to address, what Mary talked about, is that how this feeling of being different and alone and being the only Asian woman showing up on any site sometimes is not being shared and understood by the majoritarian view. The majoritarian, let's say it's white males, you know, in a lot of communities that we go into, I think that sense of the privilege that they normally have, they don't really acknowledge that there would be risks or why you have such fear. And so like seeking empathy, it's what my, you know, approach usually is to try to get people to understand. And so like when Mary and I have this opportunity to take a closer look at what happened to us, like especially my experience at the pharmacy and walking outside on the street, I hope to gain some empathy also from people who might not have such, you know, sharedness of being very different and very identifiable wherever we walk into. So that space.
Thank you. Dewitt, do you have any thoughts in terms of this portion of the conversation?
Sure, a couple of things. One, just connection on masks. The first time I went to Schnucks with a mask on, I drove to the store without a mask and then put a mask on to go in the store. And that was so counter to my understanding of what a Black man is supposed to do when he goes to a store. So just the mask thing is just been so confusing. The second thing is, and there was a comment about if you look different, and I think it's really important for us to understand different compared to what, and for more of our community to understand that there isn't just a generic different that we're talking about. We're really talking about you don't look like a white middle class cisgender male.
Yeah.
And everybody else is to some extent at risk in different ways, but there's this risk that exists out there. And I just wanted to name that it's different in comparison to something and not in comparison to the world's majority. And the world's majority is not that. And so we're really kind of behind in our understanding of what's same and what's different and whether or not that even should matter at all.
Thanks. So DeWitt, NCCJ, your organization fights racism and hate in all its forms. What are some of the other additional observations that you have?
I think and this is one of the most profound things that I learned when I connected with the NCCJ with you many years ago. And that was how often we repeat the same thing. So almost every group that has immigrated to the United States has gone through a similar stage of hate and not being welcome. And one of the things that separates that out for some of us is that we can never totally blend in. Our skin color, our eyes, our tone, our hair. For some of us, we can never blend in, but the same pattern of behavior has happened to lots of groups. And the really important piece about this is that many of the perpetrators now are from groups that at one point in time were the group that was not okay. And so that kind of cycle is super important. But one of the reasons why I was really excited to be on this pattern is because of the angst that exists between groups of color and the importance for us to not repeat those same things with us. And so there have been challenges between the Black community and the Asian community, and we need to work on those challenges and not also get caught up in repeating those same cycles. And so I was really excited to be here to just be a part of doing that.
You know, Dewitt, I'd like to kind of maybe continue down that road and let's address the bond that Black Americans and Asian Americans share, right? And share could be the simple fact that, as you've just said, have also been the receivers of acts of racism and are fighting against white supremacy, right? There are those who say our commonality is being united against, in fact, white supremacy. What's more, or maybe it's more nuanced than that. So what are your thoughts on that, Dr. Preuss?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if there's more than that. We maybe, I think both groups will experience racism. Both groups are extremely diverse, right, in terms of backgrounds and cultures and everything. And so I struggle with looking at, the commonalities of the experience, because the experiences are very different, I think, between Black people and Asians. I think it's because of the stereotypes and the history, right? They're not that easily compared in my mind. I don't know, Nicole, what do you think?
I agree with you, Mary. So, when I was reading Resource Lit Review, there were that talks about how African Americans are usually being looked down upon in history with the racism, with the slavery and all that history and entangled into that. But then they were usually counted as in group. They were counted as American. But then Asians, very differently, they have this model minority, perpetual foreigner, counting Asians as the math geek, or, we are nerdy. So they're like very different, kind of the other side of racism against Asians is to say you're model minority, so you're all fine. You're earning much better than any other average American, so you don't need any affirmative actions. You don't need any protection. You're all good. And the other part of being Asian, I think that's always assumed to be, is that submissiveness. Like Asians are supposed to be quiet and you are supposed to submit yourself. And so we're not making noise, we're not fighting for our rights. So there are a lot of those stereotypical assumptions about Asians that are very different than, I would say, our African American community.
I appreciate that, because I think often, Black people have been part of this nation since its founding, albeit as second-class citizens, but we are still seen solidly, for the most part, as American. And to your point, I think that often Asians have had the problem of being, other and foreign, no matter how long your families have lived here. And I think in many ways, that experience of being the other, both of you all are American. Both of you are American.
Yes.
And yet, and still are experiencing this ridiculousness, this hate.
So if I can identify that we're the hyphenated American, and then also I think what that comes back to is who counts as real American here. And I would going back to that white supremacist of this middle-class white male that is cisgender being, that's the norm, being like the American that's entitled to all the rights, and who would not be. So one of the examples I want to say about the perpetual foreigner is that I was constantly being asked about where you're from. So when I first moved here, and when I walk on the street with my kids, they're always asking, where are you from? So we just moved from Michigan. So I said, from Michigan. And then they said, no, you're not from Michigan. And then they start to dig deeper. So I said, well, I study in Ohio. And then he was like, no, you're not from Ohio. So I lived in multiple states, New York City, Ohio, Iowa, Missouri, and then everywhere. I've been to a lot of places in America. But then whenever I got asked the question of where you're from, if the answer is not a foreign country, they are not satisfied. And that signified to me that perpetual foreigner, no matter how long I've been here, despite being a US citizen now, I'm still being seen and counted as a foreigner.
Yeah, and I've had the exact same experiences, even though I was born in Chicago. And so when people ask, where are you from? I would say Chicago, then they keep digging. No, where are you really from? Where's your family from? And then I would say China. But it got to the point where if people ask me where I'm from, I say, I'm from Chicago, but my family's from China. That's just part of my standard answer. And the first time my husband heard that, he's like, why are you saying that? They're just asking, what state you're from, but that's not really what they're asking. And it's a constant reminder that you are seen as a foreigner.
Yeah, so if I can also piggyback on that. So my kids are Chinese, Japanese, American. They're actually mixed race, I would say. And then my kids, when they play in the playground, I still remember there's questions of why is your mom Chinese? Or why do you not look like us? So those questions always come back to signifying that we are not from here. And I think very early on when they're starting playing in the playground, I already have to teach them how to identify themselves with this knowledge of who they are, so that they won't feel like left out or being misunderstood as complete strangers and foreigners. And so that was one of the powerful examples I always cite for being perpetual foreigners here.
I really appreciate that. And it's a good transition here, because I think we know about the talk that Black families have with their children, the talk about how to move in a white world in a way that frankly won't get us killed. We're hearing more Asian parents, and you're speaking to that right now, are having their own version of the talk. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Dr. Preuss, are you also having that talk with your children, and what does it sound like, and what are you saying?
Yeah, and I don't know if it's the talk because I think there's a lot of different, backgrounds of Asians, but I think the talk that my parents gave us was to fit in, right? That was the major message that we were getting. And the message that I've tried to give to my kids, I have 2 teenagers now, and they're biracial. So they're Chinese and white, but Jewish white, so a different kind of minority. And what I've tried to tell them is that because they look different, they will often be judged based on their appearance, and that they have to represent that group, whatever they look like. My daughter looks Asian, so she represents more, East Asian. My son is actually kind of ambiguous looking, and he actually sometimes looks Hispanic to some people, but it doesn't matter, right? They look different than white people. And so I tell them that, anything that you do, you are representing those people that you look like, and that you have to keep that in mind. It might be the only interaction that somebody has, or an only substantial interaction that somebody might have with a person who's not white, and they will make a judgment about your people based on that interaction. And so that's a responsibility, I think, that we all need to keep in mind.
Thank you. Dr. Lee Johnson, what does your conversation sound like?
So mine is very similar, but I still remember deliberately going to the preschool and making sure that the teachers are aware that I want to instill that kind of racial ethnicity identity for my kids. So because in the house I'm teaching them, where they're from, where their grandparents are from, why would they be recognized as Chinese or Asian? And then, so I want the school to also know this is the family, within the parenting that we're doing, so that they can also have that taught in class. Hopefully that's working. And then when I'm talking with them privately, I always tell them, you have to tell me or a trusted adult at school in case something bad happened to you. because sometimes for that young, they don't know whether it's related to race. And then, so I still remember one example was that we were at a church gathering, and one of the kids, it's a white kid that squished his eyes and basically do that, that racism act for Asian eyes. And that actually happened to my husband when he was growing up in Washington State. And so I waited for that parent to come out, and I confronted him and told him, hey, squishing eye, it's not right because it's a racist identification of who my daughters are. And then he immediately said that, no, he's just making funny faces. So he's trying to, appease the situation and try to get away. But I did not allow that. I told him, no, this is the very racist act that you're pulling on my daughter. And so I think for me as a parent, I learned to stand up for my kids, because I know from now growing up, they are only small, right? They're like 3 and 6, but eventually when they go to Mary's kids age, teenage, or even adulthood, they really need that strong sense of who they are, to claim who they are, know that they're legitimate inside. Because I've also witnessed some of the adult immigrants who did not have that, and they felt they have to completely assimilate. And because of that, they lost a whole sense of personhood. And when they become an adult or even a senior member, they cannot get it back anymore. So it's like they lost a whole part of who they are without going deep and acknowledging and recognizing who they are. And that's why I think it's critical for teaching my kids.
Excellent, excellent. It's a hard conversation. And I think it's really interesting to hear, obviously we're talking about differences in terms of what the conversation sounds like, but the fact of the matter is that there's a need for the conversation to be had, to talk about our differences, to talk about how to protect ourselves, or the need to stand up against, in your case, Dr. Lee Johnson, basically, a bully, someone who is making fun of your child, your baby, right? Mm-hmm. And Dr. Preuss, while your students might not get the Chinese piece, right? There's this thought of them as potentially being Hispanic or Latino, and there's still that otherness. And we also know what the ramifications and what the history of those hidden stories behind here, what that still means even to be Latino or Hispanic in America, and how that mistreatment still comes about. Dewitt, are there any thoughts you want to share with us?
Just my profound sadness that any of us have to talk to our children about how to survive, or that we have to stand up for our children. And I'm also scared that we have to depend on, oftentimes, white adults to protect our children. And my experience, and I don't have kids, but my experience is that very often the adults will try and poo-poo it off as well, and not say, no, that's a racist act. We don't do that here. Stop it. And we really need to be on one accord in all saying that. I think it's just sad that we have to protect our kids in that way.
Indeed. Brian, I want to ask, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yes, we do have a question that came through Twitter. There's a question from Matali Saka. Question said, how are Asian students supported in the Webster University campuses, and what resources are available to them to cope with the current situation?
Does anyone have a response on that one?
I was trying to wait for Vincent to go first.
From what you all know, I think that one of the things that Webster, what we have done is shown up for our students in the sense of reaching out to them and letting them know that as a community, we are available to them. In many ways, in the same ways in which we've had to deal with issues for the safety and concerns of our African-American students, we are in the same way operating for our Asian students, making sure that our counseling services are available and that resources are available for them through that, and that they know how to access those services.
So Vincent, can I also reply a little bit to what you said? Absolutely right. So for the counseling service, also like, would we have any person who can speak in Chinese language or in, like multilingual counselor service? That might be really fruitful, because sometimes, having the chance to speak their native tongue really matters about whether they can trust that counselor. But number two is, I really greatly appreciate, like, now Vincent is doing the Webster Speak so that we can come and talk about anti-Asian hate. But if we can also, echo with what the Senate bill is and have any platform for our students to report anti-Asian crime, like hate or microaggressions, discriminations within Webster, that would also be, I think, welcomed by the African American and Hispanic students, any multicultural, multilingual groups that would benefit from it.
Yeah, I would agree with Nicole. I mean, the first step is just having the conversation at all. And I think that we could probably do a better job of incorporating these conversations into our classrooms, and to give students a safe place to speak to these issues and talk about their feelings. So that's something that we could definitely work on.
I appreciate that too, right? There's work for us to always do, right? And we are clear about that we don't have it right either, and that we are figuring this out along the way. We have great intentions, and I think that we have great partners in holding us accountable and holding each other accountable. But we recognize also there's still work to always be done. Dewitt, here's a question for you. Someone wrote that they have much respect for NCCJ and they wonder if there are any Asian, Muslim, or Mexican American consultants.
Sure. So our model of delivering training is through our consultants. So it makes me think that Jerry knows a little something about our structure. One of our, so our office has 3 staff members. One is white, one is Black, me, and one is Asian American. And our consultants, we have kind of different tiers of consultants. So our Train the Trainer program has served folks from many different ethnicities and religious groups. Most of the folks that train for us on a regular basis are probably white or Black or multiracial, and very few Spanish speaking or Latina or Latino identifying. And I am not aware of a second Asian identifying person at this moment. And as soon as I get off, I'm going to realize that I made a mistake in there. But the point is, I think, what is the level of diversity that you have beyond Black and white? And it's not as much as it could be.
Thank you. I want to read a text that I just received from one of our colleagues at the university. And she says that our Asian students also see Asian faces in faculty and staff, and they reach out to us for support. And I think that ties along with what you were also saying, Dr. Lee Johnson.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I do have like Asian students, Asian colleagues, faculty and staff that, we talk, and then we gain emotional support by forming allyship. That's a very important thing for supporting each other. Sometimes I would say that it might be great to also think about in the long term, like we have leadership, like we have Dr. Strobel, that's a woman. And I greatly appreciate having a woman chancellor at Webster University. How I think having these women as leadership roles really would help and encourage students who are different, than that cisgender, white male, majoritarian point of view to come to us and share their experiences and gain support.
That follows along with much of what our previous conversations have also been about, right? And that's representation. Representation matters. And I think, again, that speaks to the importance of representation. Students, faculty, staff always want to see themselves somehow reflected in leadership, be it instructional leaders, in terms of the professors, or if it's organizational, right? Yes. We want to see ourselves reflected. We want to see that it's possible, for that matter, for us, I really appreciate that. I'm curious to know, recently we're starting to hear, about these, the violence and hurt against and racism against Asians, which of course is nothing new in the United States. Again, we talked about the exclusion laws in the 1800s, the internment of the Japanese during World War II, to name just a few of the well-known examples. With few exceptions, why has racism, you think, against Asians flown under the radar for so long? And do you even agree with that? Go ahead, Dr. Lee Johnson.
Thank you. That's a fantastic question, by the way. I think for a long time, Asians were having also this stereotypical assumption of our identity. Like we are the submissive. Like for instance, me as an Asian woman, one of the things that I felt regularly is that I'm assumed to be the submissive, quiet yes woman. And so because of that stereotypical assumption, I think a lot of the times that, Asians are not supposed to be loud. We are not going to be the type of people that go on protests. We're not going to be activists. And with that assumption, and also plus a lot of the hidden, I would say, subtle racism against Asians that cause us to be not being seen. And in my lit review, I did cited some works that talked about Asian being the forgotten community, or we are the quiet and also the assistants to the powerful and the privileged. So some of the scholars also cited that work and says that Asians are always caught between the white and the black racism wall, and we're kind of not having an identity right there. So a lot of times that recently we have the terminologies like the BIPOC, and then people of colors. A lot of the times that I felt that those terms and those movements, really difficult for Asians or Chinese like me to feel like I could be part of. And I definitely feel that I'm part of it because I'm joining all the forces at Webster and outside Webster professional organizations. But I do feel there's a tension between the black and white, and especially in St. Louis community, that Asians usually kind of hard to find that positionality, that where we fit in the racism issues.
Thank you. Dr. Preuss, you have something on that?
I think Nicole said it perfectly. I mean, what is our identity? And when it comes to racism particularly, we don't tend to speak up, right? We don't tend to vote as a unit. And so it's difficult to say, why it has flown under the radar for so long. That maybe we just haven't tried to bring attention to it. And that's on us too.
That's interesting. I think about the fact, there's a Chinatown in many major cities, Chicago, New York, here, St. Louis, California, the state, San Francisco. There are also many Asian-owned restaurants, beauty supplies, nail salons, and often Asian people not only work, but live in these neighborhoods. Has this possibly caused a cultural divide with Asians and other ethnicities? And why are Asian communities seen as insular?
Yeah, those communities, I mean, definitely exist. And, I have two brothers in California, and when I visit them, I don't see many white people around, right? And so they are very insular, and, you can have entire service communities just entirely run by Asians. So it's a very different environment, definitely. And I think then the perceptions of the outside world can be very different as well.
I agree with Mary completely. So I lived in New York City for 1 year, and then for that year, I have noticed the pockets of Chinese immigrants, and they live in Flushing area. They have a whole school that is Chinese school, so everything was taught in Chinese, and so they have that community. When I visited Toronto, you see every street sign has a Chinese there. They have insurance company that's in Chinese, law services in Chinese. Everything, it's in that language. And I do want to address that distance of linguistic and cultural heritage there. So the Chinese language is very distinctive, and it's been perceived as like one of the most difficult language to learn almost. And so it's a pictograph. So you have to recognize and use your visual processing when you're reading Chinese language. It's written from right to left, and it's from up to down. So the language distance is really far away when you really study the language part of it, but also cultural practices. Like we have thousands of years of culture. And then, so there are a lot of the things that I'm trying to educate my kids that I find missing there. So for instance, we really respect the elderly, we have a lot of loyalty. So a lot of those have been, I would say, difficult to translate in different cultures and languages. And that's why it's appeared to be somewhat insular.
This is a question I'm curious about. I just had this conversation yesterday with some of our BIPOC students on campus, and it's this idea of colorism, right? And wondering, we address that within our Black community of, being light skinned versus dark skinned. At one point in time, you'd hold up a brown paper bag and there were certain sororities, Black sororities, that you couldn't be admitted into if you were darker than that shade. I see Dewitt shaking his head as well, right? I think we all are aware of this concept. And I'm curious to know, does colorism exist in Asian cultures?
In my mind, it's not colorism, but definitely there are differences in, I don't know how to say, origin. So I know when I was in college, there were the Asian Americans that hung out together, and then there are the international Asians who hung out together, right? And it depended on how long had you been in the US, or has your family been in the US? And that would then define which group you identified with more. So that's more of a divide that I see. What do you think, Nicole?
Yes, and then the complexity also within the Asian community, just like Mary talked about also, is that we identify with this homogeneous group that we're Asian, but even within Asian itself, we have so much diversity, nationality, and how different people want to identify themselves. And so like I have friends from like Singapore, from Taiwan, from Beijing, from Shanghai, from Malaysia, even friends from Malaysia that they speak different Chinese dialects within their household, like Hokkien, Cantonese, Mandarin. And because of those diversity and the value being so different within the Asian group, sometimes I think it's very difficult to use the same colorism to interpret it. But then within Asianness, though, there's a lot of diversity already that's a lot to go deeper if we want to.
I really appreciate that point there. Because I do, and I will be vulnerable here and admit myself, right? Like, I don't know enough to know the difference among the Asian nationalities and being able to identify, right? And I think that obviously is a privilege of mine, right? That I just dismiss that, right? I don't even spend time with thought on that. And so that's just some of my own vulnerability here that I'm putting out there and being honest here. And how do we do better about that and really spending time to get to know one another in that regard?
Yeah, so I want to piggyback on that. When the pandemic first came out, because I was writing articles and going to conferences, so I did some work, and I find that even within the Asian communities, there were some struggles. Like we have seen Amazon will sell T-shirts and hats that says "I'm not Chinese." And so it's because someone might look Asian, but does not want to be identified as Chinese. And so that he or she can distance himself from the Chinese virus and being attacked with hate crimes and all that. And so that created a lot of divisive forces even within the Asian community itself. And so because of that, when I was writing articles, one of my articles was in Journal of Asian Pacific Communication that talks about how we need to ask for solidarity now, like going back to supporting each other and not letting racism come. Because if you say, I'm not Chinese, but you just look Asian, the perpetrator does not care. The perpetrator is not going to stop just because you said you're not Chinese, but you look Asian. They're still going to do, racism is still there. So what we need to identify as to come out together and actually stand for each other. And even if we're witnessing something, so going back to what happened in George Floyd, a 17-year-old girl, Ms. Frazier, she took the cell phone out and videotaped what happened. We need to bear witness for one another, support each other. If we see something, we say something, we take our cell phone out, we support each other. I think that's what important to me.
You know, I think that that is a fantastic reminder to us all in terms of how do we show up for one another. We bear witness and we speak up, we show up, we stop. We take that risk to show up because that's what we should be doing. I really appreciate you all for this conversation. It always seems to go much too fast. I would like to call up, we're honored tonight to have both President Schuster as well as Chancellor Strobel with us tonight. And so they will, Brian will be pulling them up and bringing them up so they can share with us kind of their final words here. And while we're doing that, I'd like to just share with you all, if you all are enjoying this virtual series, I invite you to check out the Webster World Report podcast, a special program connecting voices across Webster during the pandemic. The 21st edition will air on May 14th. We will be celebrating 1 year online by featuring favorite interviews from the past year on a variety of topics. They include coping with the coronavirus pandemic and its impact on US foreign policy. The Webster World Report is available on YouTube, iTunes, and SoundCloud. For more information on the podcast, visit webster.edu. I will also share with you that Webster Speaks will be back on May 26th for a timely topic, Black and Blue, Policing in the Black Lives Matter Era. Registration for this program will open shortly on our page, www.webster.edu/Webster Speaks. And I now see both President Schuster and Chancellor Strobel. Good evening and welcome.
Good evening.
Well, good evening, and thank you so much for doing this program tonight, and thank you, colleagues. What an amazing conversation. And DeWitt, every single week we learn about a new childhood friend of Vincent and to a person. They are wonderful colleagues and friends to know, and thank you for being yet another.
We're happy to have Vincent at Webster.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, totally agree. And I think that unfortunately what we learn about the human impulse and the human weakness and what causes us so many issues is that we have this tendency and desire to classify everything and to categorize everything. And then, unfortunately, once we've put people and things in these boxes and the categories that make sense to us, then we assign value. And some categories get more value than others. And oh, no big surprise, the categories that are most like ourselves get the highest value, and the ones least like ourselves get the lowest value. And then we see how that turns to not just discrimination, but actual hate and violence. And I agree that using our own ability to understand what it's like to feel different and other and unsafe and not included, whatever it is. And all of us have experienced that in some shape or form. That has to be our lens to create the empathy, and as educators, because we are educators, to want to help not only our families and children, but the youth that we're working with and educating, not only feel the belonging, but help them understand what it means to be an ally and to create a really inclusive community. And tonight is a wonderful start for us. And there are many colleagues among us that are doing this work. We need to do more.
Thank you.
So, as Beth said, you know, the most important thing in everything is that we always need to remember that we are educators. And being an educator is the huge responsibility. And what I would like to use this a few moments, to bring a couple of more things, to our attention, maybe as a self-criticism, in order to prevent or to open the discussions and to bring them to the next level. I don't know why, before I start, why Vincent didn't identify yet me as his long forgotten, high school friend, but I hope, that by the May 22nd, you will do that, Vincent, right?
I will. Sure.
So, because as Beth said, we always learn something, we get a new friend from Vincent, but here it's something which I wanted to say. I'm delighted that we have a conversation, but what I would like to tell us is that we need to move from an easy conversations to a little bit harder conversation. In many respects, we as humans, we are prone to address issue, and that's not necessarily bad. First easy stuff, but then hard stuff. But we as an educators need to address the hard stuff. For example, when Dewitt said, talking about former President Trump, he didn't invent, he maybe used Chinese flu, but that was as Dewitt said, the identifying, I would say, roots of the issue with one person or with one statement would be oversimplification. One of the things that we somehow interchangeably use in this conversation, which I noticed, is Asian. We use Asian with predominantly Chinese. Asia has approximately 4 billion people. Half of them are non-Chinese. And they are Indian or from the Indian subcontinent. Webster University, when somebody asks, what do we do for our Asian students? The largest population of our students outside the United States are Asian. Yes, there is a 1,500 in Uzbekistan and 300 in China. And those things we absolutely need somehow to start thinking, what are our own stereotypes when we are talking about certain categories of people. What is the hard issue? The hard issue is that to talk that most publicized crimes that are happening against Chinese-looking people are perpetrated by the Black people. Most publicized one. I am not saying that that the hate and the root is not somewhere else, but that is, and then we need to say, why is that? And how is that coming? One possible explanation is that is the easiest ways to instill and install hatred is at the level in people mix with each other. For example, thinking about the middle class white person, man, they do not rule this country. The elite is certainly not middle class. Through the middle class, you have something which is, for the decades, if not centuries, embodied in the behavioral pattern that exists in our society, because it is a most populous part of our society. So when we are talking about Senate passing the bill, Senate, in my opinion, needs to pass a universal bill, which is not only going to protect Asian Americans, African Americans, Indian Americans. It needs to protect the humans against the hatred and against discrimination and all the evil that goes with that. And we as an educators need to be on the forefront of that fight. That is, for example, something, because humans invented separation in order to preserve and maintain their privileges, power, strength, you name it. And each and every society and community perpetuates that. We did not address, that one perennial issue that exists in the Anglo-Saxon world. And that is that people who speak English are smarter than people who don't. Generation of immigrants were telling their children, grandchildren to forget their languages, habits. And then, of course, you know, wherever possible, even looks in order to blend in. Last week, I had a privilege to have a dinner with a person called Nick Popovich. Nick Popovich is a former Marine without an eye, and on the other eye has 8% of a vision. By his last name, you understand, people who know something would know that he came from Eastern Europe. Actually, his grandparents came from the same country I did. Nick Popovich lost both eyes fighting for this country. He does not speak one word in the language of his ancestors. So what I'm trying to say by that is that if we are talking about what is happening at the surface, we as an educators need to go deep into the root of the issue. And the root of the issue was, you need to blend in, because, and I'm not going to repeat what I already said, because that is the only way that you are going to look smart and that you are going to be prosperous. Some people were not able to blend in, and some people choose not to blend. And we as an educators, again, we need to cherish all of us who would like to blend in fight against those people who forcefully try to make all other people blending in so that they can preserve the privileges that they have.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we have a sacred duty, and Webster was always on the forefront of that in its own way. Activism is not foreign to Webster. Depth of thought is not foreign to Webster. And we as a part of the Webster community, we will continue to do that. So thank you. Thank you for actually starting extremely important conversation and extremely deep issues that are confronting our society and our university. And as we move this conversation, as it's getting deeper and deeper, we came to the something which in my opinion is the pinnacle. And that is that we will not be successful if we do not rely on each other. So thank you so much for doing that. And the only thing that I can tell you, you can rely on me as much as you want. But in my fight, I will rely on you. Thank you.
Thank you, President Schuster, Chancellor Strobel, and of course to our guests, Dr. Lee Johnson, Dr. Preuss, Dewitt Campbell. Thank you all so very much for sharing your stories and for helping to frame this conversation for us. Good night to all, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.